Hi guys. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 1348 to find that the world as you know it is ending. Not through war, not through famine, but through an invisible enemy that strikes without warning and shows no mercy. The streets that were once filled with merchants hawking their wares and children playing games are now eerily silent except for the sound of cartwheels carrying the deceased to mass graves. Your neighbors, the ones you shared bread with just last week, are now behind locked doors. Some already succumbed to the mysterious illness that seems to turn skin black and steal life within days. This was the reality for millions of people during one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period so devastating that it would reshape civilization itself. The Black Death, as it came to be known, was not just a medical crisis, but a complete societal collapse that tested every aspect of human resilience, faith, and survival instinct. But here's the fascinating question that we're going to explore tonight. If you had been alive during that time, armed with nothing but observation, common sense, and a willingness to break from convention, could you have actually survived? Could you have been one of the lucky ones who made it through when half of Europe perished? Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what you would have needed to know, the decisions you would have needed to make, and the actions you would have needed to take to give yourself the best possible chance of survival during humanity's greatest pandemic. We'll explore the mistakes people made, the surprising things that actually worked, and the lessons that remain relevant even in our modern world. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To understand how you could have survived the Black Plague, we first need to understand exactly what you would have been up against. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on ships that docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. These weren't ordinary merchant vessels. They were floating tombs, with most of their crew already perished and the survivors desperately ill. The disease that they carried was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though, of course, nobody in the 14th century knew about bacteria or how diseases actually spread. What they did know was that people were getting sick and passing away at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. Within days of those ships arriving, the illness began spreading through Sicily like wildfire, and from there it moved to the Italian mainland, then to France, Spain, and eventually to every corner of Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. The plague manifested in three main forms, each more terrifying than the last. The most common was bubonic plague, named for the buboes or swollen lymph nodes that would appear in the groin, armpits, and neck of victims. These swellings could grow to the size of an apple and were excruciatingly painful. They would often turn black as the tissue began to perish, which is where the disease got its most famous name. Victims of bubonic plague would also develop fevers, chills, weakness, and often delirium. The fatality rate was around 50 to 60% if left untreated, which it always was because there was no effective treatment. The progression of bubonic plague was both rapid and horrifying to witness. Within 24 hours of infection, a person might feel perfectly normal, perhaps just experiencing some fatigue that they might attribute to a hard day's work. By the second day, the fever would set in, accompanied by severe headaches and body aches that felt like every bone was breaking. The victim would become confused, unable to think clearly or recognize loved ones. By the third day, the buboes would appear, starting as small, tender lumps but quickly swelling to grotesque proportions. The pain from these swellings was described as unbearable, and victims often screamed in agony. The skin around the buboes would turn purple, then black, as blood vessels burst and tissue died. Some victims would develop additional symptoms like vomiting blood, severe abdominal pain, or seizures. The smell of the sickness was distinctive and foul, a combination of infected tissue, fever sweat, and the peculiar odor that accompanied the disease. Those who tended to the sick reported that they could smell plague on a person before any other symptoms appeared, though this was likely a combination of fear and the actual bodily changes occurring. The second form was septicemic plague, which occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream. This form moved quickly, causing the skin to turn black from gangrene, hence another nickname for the disease, the Black Death. Septicemic plague was nearly always fatal, claiming victims within a day or two. When plague bacteria invaded the bloodstream directly, either through a flea bite that injected them into a blood vessel or as a progression from bubonic plague, the results were catastrophic. The bacteria would multiply rapidly in the blood, releasing toxins that caused blood vessels to leak and clot abnormally. This led to widespread internal bleeding and the formation of blood clots that blocked circulation to the extremities. Fingers, toes, noses, and ears would turn black as the tissue died from lack of blood flow. The victim's blood pressure would drop dangerously low, causing shock. Their organs would begin to fail one by one, first the kidneys, then the liver, then the heart. The victim would remain conscious through much of this, experiencing intense pain, confusion, and terror as they felt their bodies shutting down. Some victims of septicemic plague would develop large areas of blackened skin across their chest, back, or limbs, looking as if they had been burned. The mortality rate for septicemic plague was over 95%, and death usually came within 18 to 36 hours of the first symptoms appearing. The third and most feared form was pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs. This version was especially dangerous because it could spread directly from person to person through coughing without needing fleas or rats as intermediaries. Pneumonic plague victims would cough up blood and had a survival rate of essentially zero without modern antibiotics. When plague bacteria reached the lungs, either breathed in from another victim's cough or spreading there from bubonic or septicemic plague, they caused a rapidly progressive pneumonia. The lungs would fill with fluid and blood, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Victims would gasp for air, their lips and fingernails turning blue from lack of oxygen. They would cough violently, spraying bloody droplets into the air with each spasm. This cough was described as having a distinctive sound, a wet, rattling quality that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had heard it before. The coughing fits were exhausting and painful, and victims often broke ribs from the force of their coughing. Between fits, they would lie gasping, their breathing rapid and shallow, their faces contorted with the effort of trying to draw air into failing lungs. The progression from first symptoms to death in pneumonic plague could be as short as 24 hours. Some victims died within 12 hours of first feeling ill. The speed and the obvious contagiousness of pneumonic plague made it the most feared form, and communities where pneumonic plague appeared often experienced complete social breakdown as people fled in terror. The speed at which the plague moved was one of its most frightening characteristics. A town that seemed perfectly healthy could be decimated within weeks. Entire families would be wiped out in days. The psychological impact of this rapid devastation cannot be overstated. Imagine watching your spouse develop a fever in the morning, seeing the telltale swellings appear by afternoon, and having to prepare for burial by the next day. This happened thousands upon thousands of times across the continent. The social fabric of medieval life completely unraveled. Priests refused to give last rites. Physicians fled cities. Parents abandoned sick children, and children abandoned sick parents. The normal bonds of family and community, which were the foundation of medieval society, dissolved in the face of such overwhelming terror and loss. Now, here's what you would have needed to understand to survive. The plague was primarily spread by fleas that lived on black rats. These rats were everywhere in medieval cities and towns. They lived in the thatched roofs of houses, in the walls, in the streets where garbage was thrown, and in the warehouses where grain was stored. The fleas would feed on an infected rat, picking up the Yersinia pestis bacteria, and then, when that rat perished, the fleas would seek out a new host, often humans. When a flea bit a human, it would regurgitate bacteria into the wound, causing infection. This is how bubonic plague spread. The pneumonic form, as mentioned, could spread through the air from human to human, making it even more dangerous. But here's the key insight that could have saved your life. If you had somehow figured out that proximity to sick people and to rats was the danger, you could have taken steps to protect yourself. Understanding the rat-flea-human connection would have been revolutionary in the 14th century, even though you wouldn't have understood the bacterial mechanism behind it. Medieval people did notice that rats seemed to die in large numbers just before human plague outbreaks began. Some observers recorded this phenomenon, noting that streets would be littered with rat carcasses days or weeks before the first human cases appeared. However, most people interpreted this as a sign or omen rather than as a causal connection. They thought the rats were dying from the same bad air or divine punishment that would soon affect humans, rather than understanding that the rats were the source of the problem. If you had made the intellectual leap to understand that the rats themselves were dangerous, not just fellow victims, you would have had a crucial advantage. This would have meant viewing rats not as a normal, unavoidable part of urban life, but as active threats to be eliminated or avoided at all costs. The life cycle of the rat flea was perfectly suited to spreading plague, though of course nobody in medieval times understood this. The oriental rat flea, Xenopsila chopis, was the primary vector. These fleas preferred to feed on rats, particularly black rats, which lived in close proximity to humans throughout medieval Europe. When a flea bit an infected rat, it would ingest blood containing plague bacteria. The bacteria would multiply in the flea's digestive system, forming a blockage in the flea's throat that prevented it from properly digesting blood. This made the flea desperately hungry, causing it to bite repeatedly as it tried to feed. Each time the blocked flea bit, it would regurgitate bacteria-laden blood back into the wound, efficiently transmitting the disease. When the rat host died, the fleas would abandon the cooling corpse and seek a new warm-blooded host, which in human dwellings was usually a human. A single infected flea could potentially infect multiple people as it bit repeatedly trying to feed. Understanding even part of this chain, particularly the connection between rat deaths, flea activity, and human illness, would have given you actionable information to protect yourself. The first and most important survival strategy would have been isolation and distance. In medieval times, this would have been an incredibly difficult decision to make because it went against every social and religious norm of the period. Medieval society was built on community, on obligations to your lord, your guild, your church, and your family. The idea of abandoning your post or your family would have been seen as the ultimate cowardice and sin. But survival would have required exactly this kind of radical departure from normal behavior. If you had lived in a city when the plague arrived, your best chance of survival would have been to leave immediately before the outbreak became widespread. This is exactly what many wealthy nobles and merchants did, retreating to country estates far from urban centers. They were widely criticized for this, accused of abandoning their responsibilities, but they were also far more likely to survive. Where you went would have mattered enormously. You would have wanted to head to a location that was remote, had few visitors, and ideally was at a higher elevation. Higher elevations tended to be cooler, which was less hospitable to fleas, and they were also less likely to be on major trade routes. You would want to avoid main roads, because roads meant travelers, and travelers could be carriers. Instead, you would look for isolated farmsteads, mountain villages, or even caves or forest clearings where you could set up a temporary camp. Some monasteries that were located in remote areas and that sealed themselves off completely did manage to escape the plague entirely. The key was creating a barrier between yourself and the rest of human civilization for the duration of the outbreak. The decision of exactly where to establish your refuge would have required careful consideration of multiple factors. Water supply was paramount, as you would need access to clean drinking water without having to travel to public wells or streams that others might use. A natural spring on private land would have been ideal, or a location near a fast-moving stream in an isolated area where contamination from upstream sources was unlikely. The terrain should offer natural defensive advantages, not against military attack, but against casual visitors and wanderers. A location that was difficult to reach, perhaps requiring knowledge of obscure trails or paths, would discourage random travelers from stumbling upon your refuge. You would want to be far enough from any settlement that you wouldn't encounter people, but not so remote that the journey there would be impossibly difficult if you were traveling with family members, supplies, or animals. The availability of food sources in and around your refuge location would determine whether you could sustain yourself for the duration of the outbreak. Ideally, you would want access to wild game for hunting, edible plants and berries, fish if near water, and land suitable for a quick garden if you arrived early enough in the growing season to plant crops. Forest areas offered more wild food sources than open grasslands, but they also harbored more wildlife that could carry other diseases or pose physical threats. A balance was needed, perhaps an area of mixed forest and cleared land where you could garden while also having access to wild foods. Some survivors established themselves in abandoned farms or estates in remote areas where previous occupants had already cleared land and built structures but had died or fled, leaving the property vacant. The shelter you created or occupied at your refuge would need to protect you not just from weather, but from disease vectors. If you were building a temporary camp, you would want to construct your shelter off the ground if possible, perhaps building a platform or using a naturally elevated area like a rock outcrop. This would create separation from ground-dwelling rodents and fleas. Your shelter should be as tightly sealed as possible while still allowing ventilation for fire smoke to escape. Natural materials like bark, hides, or tightly woven branches could create walls that rats couldn't easily penetrate. If you were occupying an existing structure, you would need to spend considerable time thoroughly cleaning it, checking for and sealing any rat entry points, removing all old bedding or stored materials that might harbor fleas, and possibly fumigating with smoke before moving in. The time spent preparing your shelter properly would be time well invested in your survival. The psychological challenge of isolation in a remote location shouldn't be underestimated. Humans are social creatures, and cutting yourself off from all human contact for months would have been extraordinarily difficult, even with the fear of plague as motivation. If you were alone, the loneliness could become crushing. If you were with family, tensions could arise from being in close quarters with no outside social interaction to diffuse conflicts. You would need to find ways to maintain mental health in isolation, perhaps through daily routines, physical work like maintaining your camp and gathering food, creative activities like carving or weaving if you had materials, and for those who were religious, prayer and contemplation. Some people who survived long periods of isolation during the plague reported that they talked to themselves, to animals, or to imagined companions as a way of maintaining their sanity. While this might seem strange, it was actually an adaptive response to prolonged social isolation. But let's say you couldn't leave your town or city for some reason. Maybe you didn't have the resources to travel, or you had obligations you felt you couldn't abandon, or perhaps the city gates had been closed and quarantines put in place, trapping you inside. What then? Your survival would have depended on creating distance within your environment. The first rule would have been to avoid sick people entirely. This sounds obvious, but in practice, it meant breaking some deeply held social contracts. If your neighbor came to your door asking for help because their child was sick, you would have had to refuse. If you heard that someone in your street had developed symptoms, you would need to avoid that entire area. Many people caught the plague because they were caring for sick family members, which was considered both a family duty and a religious obligation. Survival would have required putting self-preservation above these obligations. Your home would need to become a fortress. Medieval homes were not built with hygiene in mind. They typically had dirt floors, very limited ventilation, and were often shared with animals. To survive, you would need to make several modifications. First, you would need to seal off any openings where rats could enter. This means plugging holes in walls, fixing any damaged areas of the roof, and ensuring the doors and windows could be tightly closed. You would need to remove any stored grain or food that might attract rats, or store it in sealed containers that rats couldn't access. If you had animals, you would ideally keep them outside the main living area because animals could host fleas that might carry the disease from rats. The medieval home was a far different structure than what we think of as a house today, and understanding its vulnerabilities was essential for plague survival. Most common people lived in simple 1- or 2-room structures with walls made of wattle and daub, which is essentially woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. These walls, while providing shelter from weather, were full of gaps and crevices that rats could exploit. The roofs were typically thatched, made from bundles of dried reeds, straw, or grass laid over wooden frames. Rats loved thatched roofs because they provided excellent nesting material, insulation, and countless hiding places. A family might have dozens of rats living in their roof without even knowing it, until the rats became bold enough to venture down into the living space in search of food. To secure your home against rats, you would need to inspect every inch of your walls and roof, looking for gaps, holes, or loose areas where rats might enter or already be living. Plugging these gaps was labor-intensive but critical work. You would need to use whatever materials were available, pressing clay or mud mixed with straw into cracks, nailing or tying additional layers of material over damaged areas, and possibly even rebuilding sections of wall if they were too compromised. The area where the walls met the roof was particularly vulnerable, as this junction was often imperfectly sealed and provided an easy access point for climbing rodents. You might need to add a barrier of some kind, perhaps a layer of slate or wood, to create a rat-proof seal. Windows in medieval homes were typically just openings in the walls, sometimes with wooden shutters, but often with nothing at all. During plague time, these would need to be covered in some way that allowed light and air but prevented rat entry. Tightly woven cloth or a screen made from thin wooden slats might work, though you would need to check these barriers regularly for damage. The floor of a medieval home was usually just packed dirt, which presented multiple problems for plague prevention. Dirt floors harbored fleas, provided easy burrowing access for rats, and couldn't be thoroughly cleaned. If you had the resources and time, covering the dirt floor with a layer of flat stones, wood planks, or thick clay tiles would create a more sanitary and secure surface. This was a major undertaking and not feasible for many people, but even smaller improvements helped. Sweeping the dirt floor daily removed flea eggs and larvae. Occasionally wetting the floor and sweeping it created a surface that fleas couldn't easily move across. Some people scattered herbs with insect-repelling properties like pennyroyal, tansy, or fleabane on their floors, both for the practical effect of discouraging fleas and for the psychological comfort of feeling they were doing something to protect themselves. The herbs would be swept up and replaced regularly, with the old herbs burned outside to kill any fleas that might be hiding in them. Storage of food within the home required complete reorganization for plague survival. Traditional storage methods involved keeping grain in sacks or barrels, dried meat hanging from rafters, and vegetables in baskets or piles in a corner. All of these methods were vulnerable to rats. To protect your food supply, you would need sealed containers that rats couldn't chew through or climb into. Pottery vessels with tight-fitting lids were ideal but expensive. Wooden boxes with well-fitted lids could work if the wood was thick and hard enough that rats couldn't gnaw through it. Hanging food from the ceiling might seem safe, but rats were excellent climbers and could often reach hanging items by climbing the walls or rafters. Better to store food in containers and then either bury those containers outside in a location you marked carefully so you could find them again, or store them on high shelves that were isolated from walls and climbing paths, perhaps on platforms supported by smooth poles that rats couldn't easily climb. The question of animals living in or near your home was complex. Many medieval families kept chickens, pigs, goats, or even cows in attached sheds or even in the same building where they lived, especially during cold weather. These animals provided valuable food in the form of eggs, milk, and eventually meat, but they also attracted rats and could harbor fleas. For plague survival, you would need to physically separate your animals from your living space. Build or designate a separate shelter for them, even if it was crude, and keep them there rather than allowing them into your living area. Keep their shelter as clean as possible, removing waste daily and providing fresh bedding regularly. Check the animals regularly for fleas, which were visible if you looked carefully through their fur or feathers. Animals that were heavily infested with fleas might need to be culled, as harsh as that sounds, because they represented a disease risk that outweighed their value. Cleanliness would be your next priority, though this was a foreign concept in many ways to medieval people. Bathing was not a daily occurrence, and in fact, there were religious movements that saw excessive bathing as sinful vanity. But to survive the plague, you would need to wash regularly, particularly your hands and any clothes that might have come into contact with others. You would want to use hot water if possible, as heat kills both fleas and bacteria, though, of course, medieval people didn't understand the mechanism. You would also want to wash your bedding frequently and keep your living space as clean as possible, sweeping daily to remove any fleas that might have entered. The medieval attitude toward bathing and cleanliness was complicated and often contradicted the practices that would have helped prevent plague. In the early medieval period, public bathhouses had been relatively common in cities, inherited from Roman traditions. People would gather at these bathhouses not just to wash, but to socialize and conduct business. However, by the 14th century, many of these bathhouses had closed or fallen into disrepute, partly due to concerns about moral impropriety, but also because medical theories of the time suggested that bathing could be dangerous. Medieval physicians believed that bathing opened the pores of the skin, allowing bad air or disease to enter the body. Some religious movements promoted the idea that bodily cleanliness was less important than spiritual purity, and that suffering the discomfort of a dirty body was a form of holy mortification. Some saints were even celebrated for never bathing, as a sign of their rejection of worldly comforts. For plague survival, you would need to reject these prevailing attitudes and recognize that cleanliness, particularly of your hands, body, and living space, provided protection. Even without understanding germ theory, you could observe that people who washed regularly seemed to fare better with various illnesses. Washing your hands after any contact with surfaces that others had touched, after handling animals, after using the latrine, and before eating would have been one of the single most effective protective measures you could take. Medieval soap was typically made from animal fats and wood ash, creating a harsh but effective cleaning agent. If you didn't have soap, scrubbing with just water and sand or ash would still have removed many contaminants. The water temperature mattered significantly. Cold water washing was better than nothing, but hot water was far more effective at killing fleas and removing bacteria. Heating water was labor-intensive, requiring collection of firewood and time spent tending a fire, but it was worth the effort during plague time. Washing your body completely, not just your hands and face, would have required significant effort in the medieval context. Most people didn't have bathtubs. Instead, bathing involved heating large amounts of water, pouring it into a large wooden tub or basin, and then climbing in. This might happen in the main living area near the fire, or, in warmer weather, outside. The entire process, from starting the fire to finishing the bath, might take several hours. During plague time, bathing once a week would have been a reasonable goal, with daily washing of hands, face, and any exposed skin that might have come into contact with contamination. After bathing, you would need to put on clean clothes rather than putting dirty clothes back on a clean body, which meant you needed multiple sets of clothing and a system for washing clothes regularly. Laundry was an enormous undertaking in medieval times, and understanding how to do it effectively would have been important for plague survival. Clothes were typically made of wool or linen, which were sturdy but required careful washing to avoid damage. The process involved soaking the clothes in water, often with soap or lye added, then beating or pounding them to force the cleaning agents through the fabric, and finally rinsing multiple times to remove the soap. This would be done in a large tub or at a stream if one was safely accessible. For plague protection, the key was to use the hottest water you could manage without damaging the fabric, as the heat would kill fleas and bacteria. After washing, clothes should be dried in direct sunlight if possible, as sunlight has antibacterial properties, though medieval people wouldn't have known this. They might have simply observed that sun-dried clothes seemed fresher than those dried in the dark indoors. Bedding presented special challenges because it was bulky and difficult to wash. Medieval beds for common people often consisted of a wooden frame with rope or leather straps stretched across to support a mattress. The mattress was typically a large cloth sack stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. Blankets and sheets, if people had them at all, were valuable possessions. For plague survival, your bedding needed to be checked and cleaned regularly. The straw in mattresses should be completely replaced every few weeks, with the old straw burned to kill any fleas. If your mattress was stuffed with wool or feathers, it couldn't be easily emptied and refilled, so instead it would need to be beaten vigorously to dislodge any fleas, then hung in bright sunlight for several hours. Blankets and sheets should be washed in hot water as often as practical, certainly at least every 2 weeks, and hung to dry in the sun. Some people, during the plague, took to sleeping in their clothes on top of their blankets rather than under them, reasoning that it was easier to wash their body and clothes than to wash large blankets, and this actually made sense from a hygiene standpoint. Food acquisition would have been one of your biggest challenges during the plague years. Markets would have become extremely dangerous places, full of people in close proximity, many of whom might be infected or in contact with infected individuals. If you absolutely had to go to a market, you would want to go early in the morning when fewer people were there, move quickly to get what you needed, avoid touching surfaces when possible, and wash thoroughly when you returned home. Ideally, you would have stocked up on non-perishable supplies before the plague arrived in your area, things like dried grains, salted meat, dried beans, and preserved vegetables. If you had a garden or yard, growing your own food would have been invaluable, both for the nutrition and for the fact that it meant fewer trips to public spaces. Medieval markets were typically held once or twice a week in designated areas of towns and villages, and they were the social and economic center of community life. People would gather not just to buy and sell goods, but to exchange news, socialize, and conduct all manner of business. In normal times, The market was a place of energy and life, with vendors calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices, animals being traded, and street performers entertaining the crowd. But during plague time, markets became sites of transmission and death. People who were infected but not yet showing symptoms would walk among the crowds. Vendors handling goods with contaminated hands would pass infection to customers. Coins changing hands would carry bacteria. The close proximity of bodies in a crowded market space meant that pneumonic plague could spread through coughing or even just breathing. If you had to visit a market during the plague, your strategy would need to be carefully planned. First, you would observe the market from a distance before entering, looking at how crowded it was and whether you could see any obviously sick people. Early morning markets were less crowded because only the most dedicated vendors and buyers would rise before dawn, but the selection of goods would also be better as nothing had sold yet. You would make a mental list of exactly what you needed before going, so you could move efficiently without lingering or browsing. Once in the market, you would maintain maximum distance from others, avoiding the most crowded sections entirely, even if they had goods you wanted. When selecting produce or goods, you would avoid items that many others had handled. Items that could be washed or peeled before eating were safer than those that would be eaten as is. When paying, you might place coins down on a vendor's table rather than handing them directly, avoiding hand-to-hand contact. Some vendors during the plague started using vinegar baths for coins, believing it would cleanse them, and while this had limited actual effect, it showed awareness that objects could carry disease. Upon returning home from a market trip, you would need to follow a decontamination routine. Any baskets or bags you carried should be left outside your door initially. The food items you purchased would need to be handled carefully. Produce should be washed thoroughly in water, or in vinegar if you had it. Items with inedible outer coverings, like cabbage or onions, could have the outer layers removed and discarded. Grain or flour should be inspected for any signs of rat or flea contamination before being stored. Any cloth or goods you purchased should be aired outside in sunlight for several days before being brought into your living space, as this would allow time for any fleas to die and be blown away by wind. Your clothes worn to market should be removed at the door and washed before being worn again. Finally, you would wash your hands, face, and any exposed skin thoroughly with hot water and soap. This entire process was exhausting and time-consuming, which is why minimizing market visits was so important. Growing your own food became not just economically sensible, but a survival necessity during the plague. Even a small garden plot could provide vegetables that supplemented your diet and reduced your dependence on markets. Medieval gardens typically included practical crops like cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, beans, herbs, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots. Fruit trees like apples, pears, and plums were valuable if you had space and time for them to mature, though they took years to become productive. Berry bushes like raspberries and blackberries could provide fruit more quickly. A garden could be started from seeds you saved from previous years, or from starts you obtained from neighbors before the plague arrived. Once the plague was active in your area, you would avoid accepting any plants or seeds from others, as you couldn't know if they had been handled by infected individuals or been in contact with rats or fleas. The work of maintaining a garden during plague time had the additional benefit of providing purposeful activity and keeping you outdoors in sunlight and fresh air, which was healthier than spending all day indoors in fear. The physical labor of digging, planting, weeding, and harvesting was good for your body and mind. Gardens required daily attention, particularly in the growing season, which gave structure to your days. Watching plants grow and produce food provided hope and a sense of future, important psychological anchors when everything else seemed uncertain and dark. The food from your garden was also maximally safe because you controlled it completely from seed to harvest, knowing that no one else had handled it and that it hadn't passed through potentially contaminated markets or storage areas. Foraging for wild foods could supplement your diet if you knew what to look for and where to find it. Medieval peasants were often quite knowledgeable about wild edibles, as these foods helped them survive times of scarcity. Depending on your region and the season, you might find wild greens like dandelions, nettles, or sorrel. Mushrooms, though you needed to be absolutely certain of your identification, as some varieties were deadly. Nuts like walnuts, chestnuts, or hazelnuts, and berries like blackberries, elderberries, or wild strawberries. Foraging had the advantage of taking you away from populated areas into fields and forests where the plague risk was minimal. However, you needed to be careful about foraging locations. Areas near towns or along paths might be visited by others, including potentially infected people, so more remote foraging sites were better, even if they required longer travel. Water sources would also require careful consideration. If you drew water from a public well, you would be in contact with others and touching shared surfaces like the well bucket and rope. If possible, having your own water source, like a rainwater collection system or a private well, would have been ideal. If you had to use public water sources, you would want to go at off hours when few others were there, and again, wash your hands afterward. Boiling water before drinking it would have been a good practice, though medieval people might have done this anyway for preparing meals or making simple beverages, without understanding that boiling actually purified the water. The question of protective clothing and barriers is an interesting one. The famous plague doctor costume, with its beaked mask filled with herbs and aromatic substances, wasn't actually invented until the 17th century, well after the Black Death. However, the principle behind it was sound, creating a barrier between yourself and potentially infected people. If you had to venture out during the plague, covering your skin as completely as possible would have been wise. This would prevent flea bites and would also create a barrier against pneumonic plague if you encountered someone coughing. Thick clothing made of tightly woven fabric would be best, as fleas would have difficulty penetrating it. Some people did wear gloves and wrapped cloth around their faces, practices that were mocked by some, but that actually would have provided some protection. Smoke and fire were widely believed in medieval times to purify the air and ward off the plague. While the reasoning was wrong, people thought the plague was caused by miasma or bad air. The practice actually had some benefits. Smoke from fires, particularly fires burning aromatic woods or herbs, would have helped keep flying insects, including fleas, at bay. The heat from fires would also have killed fleas in clothing or bedding held over the flames. Some towns burned barrels of tar in the streets, believing the smoke would cleanse the air. This probably did little to stop the spread of the plague, but for an individual household, maintaining a fire and occasionally smoking out your living space might have reduced the flea population and provided some marginal benefit. The use of herbs and plants is another area where medieval practices, though based on incorrect understanding, might have provided some help. Many people carried bundles of aromatic herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme, believing these would protect against plague. These herbs do have some insect-repelling properties, so wearing them or scattering them around your home might have helped discourage fleas. Garlic was also widely believed to have protective properties, and while eating garlic wouldn't cure or prevent plague, some studies have shown that consuming large amounts of garlic can slightly alter body odor in ways that some insects find less attractive. This is extremely marginal, but in a situation where every small advantage mattered, it might have helped slightly. One of the most controversial aspects of plague survival was the question of whether to help others or to focus solely on self-preservation. From a pure survival standpoint, the answer would have been clear. Avoid all contact with sick people, even family members. Some people did abandon their sick relatives and flee, and they were condemned for it, but many of them survived. Others stayed to care for loved ones, fulfilling what they saw as their moral and religious duty, and many of them contracted the plague and perished as a result. There's no easy answer here, but if survival was your primary goal, you would have needed to make the difficult choice to maintain distance even from those you loved once they showed symptoms. Some families tried to isolate sick members in a separate room or building, caring for them from a distance by leaving food and water at the door, and this would have been a compromise that provided some care while reducing transmission risk. The role of animals in your survival strategy would have been complex. On one hand, cats and dogs could have been valuable allies in controlling rat populations. Cats in particular were efficient rat hunters, and having several cats around your property would have reduced the number of rats and therefore the number of plague-carrying fleas. However, there was a tragic irony during the Black Death. Many people believed that cats were associated with witchcraft and the devil, and in some areas, cats were killed in large numbers because people thought they might be spreading the plague. This had the opposite effect, allowing rat populations to explode without their natural predators. If you had understood the value of cats and protected them, you would have been better off. Dogs were less efficient at catching rats, but they could serve as early warning systems, barking when strangers or animals approached your property, allowing you to take evasive action. The medieval relationship with cats was complicated, and this had dire consequences during the plague. In ancient times, and in some non-European cultures, cats were revered as sacred or valuable animals. However, in medieval Europe, cats had become associated with superstition and evil, particularly black cats. This association intensified during the 13th century with increasing concern about witchcraft and heresy. Pope Gregory IX had issued a papal bull in 1233 that associated cats, particularly black ones, with devil worship. This led to cats being persecuted across Europe. They were killed in religious ceremonies, thrown from towers, burned alive, or simply destroyed whenever found. The persecution intensified just before the Black Death arrived, meaning that cat populations in many areas were at historic lows precisely when they would have been most valuable. If you had recognized that cats were actually protecting you by hunting rats, you would have needed to hide and protect any cats you kept, as your neighbors might kill them if given the chance. You would keep your cats well fed so they would stay on your property and continue hunting the local rat population. A good mouser cat could kill multiple rats per day, and a small group of cats working a property could significantly reduce the local rat population. You would need to check your cats regularly for fleas and remove any you found, as cats could carry fleas though they weren't the primary host for the oriental rat flea that spread plague. Despite the risks, maintaining a population of cats on your property would have been one of the most effective rat control measures available in the medieval period. Dogs played a different role in plague survival. While most dogs weren't skilled rat catchers, they provided other benefits. A dog could alert you to the approach of strangers, giving you time to avoid contact or prepare to maintain safe distance. In isolated rural locations, a dog could warn of approaching wildlife or other threats. Dogs also provided companionship during isolation, which had significant value for mental health. The loyalty and affection of a dog could be a source of comfort and emotional support during the darkest times. However, dogs did come with risks. They were more likely than cats to approach other people or animals, potentially bringing back fleas or even making contact with infected individuals. A dog would need to be trained to stay close to your property and not wander. You would need to check their fur regularly for fleas and remove any found. In some cases, if a dog became too flea-infested, you might face the heartbreaking decision of whether to cull the animal to protect your household. Other domestic animals had various roles to play. Chickens provided eggs and eventually meat, but they needed to be kept in secure coops that prevented rats from accessing their food and nesting areas. Chicken coops were notorious for attracting rats because of the grain used to feed the birds and the warmth of the environment. A well-built, rat-proof coop was essential, with barriers that prevented rats from burrowing underneath and secure latches that kept the door tightly closed. Goats and sheep could provide milk, wool, and meat, and they were less likely than chickens to attract rats, though their feed still needed to be stored carefully. Pigs were omnivorous scavengers that ate almost anything, which made them economically valuable, but also meant they had to be kept far from your living area, as they attracted all manner of pests and created sanitation problems. Cows or oxen were valuable for milk and labor, but required substantial grazing land and were difficult to maintain if you were in isolation. The question of whether to keep animals at all during plague time involved weighing their benefits against their risks. Animals were a source of food and therefore critical for survival, but they also complicated your isolation strategy and created additional work in terms of keeping their areas clean and rat-free. If you were fleeing to a remote location, bringing animals would slow your travel and make you more conspicuous. But arriving at your refuge without any animals meant you would be entirely dependent on foraging, gardening, and any supplies you carried. Many people made the compromise of bringing a few chickens for eggs, perhaps a goat for milk, and a dog for companionship and wanting, while leaving behind larger animals that would be too difficult to maintain in isolation. Others left all animals behind and planned to rely on wild game and plants, accepting the limitations this imposed on their diet. The timing of your activities would have mattered significantly. Fleas are most active during warm months and in warm environments. They're less active in cold weather and at night when temperatures drop. This means that plague transmission was seasonal to some degree, typically peaking in late summer and early fall when both rat and flea populations were at their highest. Winter provided some relief, as cold temperatures killed many fleas and slowed their reproduction. If you were going to have to venture out or have any unavoidable contact with others, doing so during winter would have been slightly safer than summer. Similarly, conducting necessary activities in early morning or late evening when temperatures were cooler would have reduced flea activity slightly. Personal hygiene practices extended beyond just bathing. You would want to check your body daily for fleas and for any signs of bites or the development of buboes. Early detection could have made a difference in some cases. While there was no cure for plague in medieval times, some people did survive bubonic plague, particularly if they were otherwise healthy and strong. Pneumonic and septicemic plague were almost always fatal, but bubonic plague had a survival rate that, while low, wasn't zero. Keeping your body strong through adequate nutrition, rest, and avoiding stress would have given you the best possible immune response if you were exposed. Medieval medicine didn't understand immune systems, but they did understand that well-fed, well-rested people generally fared better with illness than those who were already weakened. Daily body inspection would have been a crucial practice that required discipline and attention. You would need to check every part of your body systematically, looking for the small red bumps that indicated flea bites and feeling for any swellings in your lymph nodes. The most important areas to check were the groin, armpits, and neck, as these were where buboes typically appeared first. Running your fingers along these areas each morning and evening, feeling for any unusual lumps or tender spots, could give you early warning if you had been infected. Flea bites themselves were common even without plague, as fleas were ubiquitous in medieval life. But during plague time, every bite had to be treated as potentially dangerous. The bites would appear as small raised bumps, often in clusters or lines where a flea had bitten multiple times. They were intensely itchy, and scratching them could break the skin and potentially introduce other infections. If you discovered flea bites on your body, your immediate response would be critical. First, you would need to find and remove any fleas that might still be on you. This required careful examination of your body, particularly in hairy areas where fleas could hide, and your clothing, where fleas would nestle in seams and folds. Any fleas found should be killed immediately, which was harder than it sounds because fleas have hard shells that resist crushing. The most effective method was to trap the flea between your fingernails and squeeze hard, or to drop it into a cup of water where it would drown. After removing any fleas, you would wash the bitten areas thoroughly with hot water and soap. Some people applied various substances to the bites, such as vinegar, garlic paste, or herbal preparations, none of which would prevent plague infection if the flea had already transmitted bacteria, but washing at least removed any bacteria remaining on the skin's surface. For the next several days, you would need to monitor yourself carefully for the first signs of plague, fever, headache, and most critically, the development of buboes. Maintaining your physical strength and health during plague time was as important as avoiding exposure. A strong, healthy body with a robust immune system had a better chance of fighting off plague infection if it occurred. This meant ensuring adequate nutrition even when food was scarce or variety was limited. The medieval diet for common people was often deficient in various nutrients, being heavily based on bread and porridge with limited meat, vegetables, or fruits. During plague time, when maintaining health was critical, you would need to eat as varied and nutrient-rich a diet as possible. This meant consuming whatever vegetables you could grow or forage, eating protein from eggs, dairy, or preserved meat when available, and not skimping on portions in an attempt to stretch supplies. Some people made the mistake of rationing food too severely during plague time, weakening themselves and making them more susceptible to disease. Better to eat well and perhaps have to make another supply run sooner than to weaken yourself with insufficient nutrition. Sleep and rest were equally important for maintaining health. The stress and fear of living through the plague made sleep difficult for many people. They would lie awake at night, listening to every sound, wondering if that cough they heard in the distance was plague, or worrying about loved ones who might be sick. Some people had nightmares about the disease, waking up in terror convinced they had symptoms. Chronic sleep deprivation weakened the body and made people less able to cope with both physical and psychological stresses. To promote better sleep during this anxious time, maintaining regular sleep schedules helped, going to bed and rising at the same times each day, even when there was no external reason to do so. Creating a comfortable, secure sleeping environment that felt as safe as possible helped. For those who found religious faith comforting, evening prayers or meditation before sleep could calm the mind. Physical work during the day, whether tending your garden, maintaining your shelter, or other activities, created healthy fatigue that promoted better sleep. Stress management was another aspect of maintaining health that medieval people understood intuitively, even if they didn't have modern terminology for it. Chronic stress weakens the immune system and makes people more susceptible to illness. The plague environment was maximally stressful, with constant fear, social isolation, grief over lost loved ones, and uncertainty about the future. People who found ways to manage this stress, whether through prayer, meditation, physical work, creative activities, or maintaining hope and positive focus, would have been healthier than those who gave in to despair and anxiety. Some people survived plague exposure that killed others, and while there were certainly biological factors involved, psychological state and stress levels may have played a role in determining who survived and who didn't. A person who maintained hope and fought to live might have had a measurably different immune response than someone who gave up and accepted death as inevitable. The question of medical treatment during the plague is both fascinating and tragic. Medieval medicine was based largely on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance in these humors, and treatments were designed to restore balance. For plague, this often meant bloodletting, the practice of deliberately cutting a patient to remove excess blood, which was thought to be in surplus. Of course, this actually weakened already sick people and made them less likely to survive. Other common treatments included applying various poultices to the buboes, sometimes containing everything from lily root to dried toad, or administering mixtures containing ground emeralds, gold, or pearls for wealthy patients. None of these treatments were effective, and many were actively harmful. If you wanted to survive, you would have been better off avoiding physicians entirely and relying instead on rest, hydration, and prayer if that provided psychological comfort. The medieval medical establishment was completely unprepared for and unable to effectively respond to the plague. Physicians of the time had been trained in universities where they studied ancient texts by Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. These texts described diseases and treatments that had been observed 1,000 or more years earlier, and medieval physicians treated them as absolute authority. When the plague arrived, physicians attempted to understand it through this classical framework, which meant they fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. They believed plague was caused by a corruption of the air called miasma, which came from rotting organic matter, astrological influences, or divine punishment. Treatment approaches were based on this incorrect understanding, which meant they were at best useless and at worst actively harmful. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical intervention during the plague, and it demonstrated the danger of confidently applied but wrong medical theory. Physicians believed that plague was associated with an excess of blood, and that removing some blood would restore balance and help the body fight the disease. They would use lancets to cut into veins, usually in the arms, and allow blood to flow out into a bowl. The amount of blood removed could be substantial, sometimes a pint or more. For a patient who was already weakened by plague, losing this much blood could push them past the point where their body could recover. Dehydration, which was already a problem with plague due to fever and sweating, would be worsened by blood loss. The anemia caused by removing blood would weaken the immune response further. And if the bloodletting instruments weren't clean, which they often weren't, the procedure could introduce additional infections. Yet physicians were so confident in this treatment that they would sometimes perform bloodletting multiple times on the same patient, progressively weakening them until death became inevitable. Other medical treatments were equally misguided. Purging, which meant inducing vomiting or diarrhea through various medicines, was thought to expel corrupt humors from the body. Patients who were already losing fluids through fever and sweating would be given powerful laxatives or emetics, pushing them further into dangerous dehydration. Cautery, the burning of skin with hot irons, was sometimes applied to buboes, based on the theory that burning would drive out disease. This caused terrible pain and burns, but did nothing to address the bacterial infection. Various toxic substances, including mercury and arsenic, were administered in small doses, based on the idea that these powerful substances would fight the powerful disease. These substances sometimes made patients more ill without providing any benefit. Theriac, a supposedly universal remedy that contained dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh, was prescribed widely despite being expensive and ineffective. Some physicians did attempt surgical interventions, particularly lancing the buboes to drain them. This was actually one of the few medieval treatments that might have provided some benefit. If done early, before the lymph node had ruptured internally, draining the pus and bacteria from the bubo could reduce the bacterial load in the body and potentially increase survival chances. However, the procedure had to be done carefully to avoid spreading infection further. The wound needed to be kept clean afterward, which was difficult with medieval understanding of infection. Many patients who had buboes lanced developed secondary infections from dirty instruments or improper wound care, which could kill them even if they might have survived the original plague infection. Still, some people who had their buboes lanced and properly drained did survive, giving this intervention a better track record than most medieval medical treatments. If you or a family member developed plague symptoms, your best course of action would have been to avoid calling for a physician and instead provide supportive care at home. This meant keeping the patient as comfortable as possible, ensuring they drank plenty of water or other fluids to combat fever and dehydration, keeping them warm but not overheated, and keeping the room clean and as free of stress as possible. If buboes developed and became large and extremely painful, you might consider lancing them yourself, though this required considerable courage. You would heat a knife blade in fire to sterilize it, then make a small cut in the bubo to allow it to drain. The pus that came out needed to be collected and disposed of carefully, ideally burned, and the wound then washed with the cleanest water available, or with wine or vinegar which had some antiseptic properties. This was dangerous and painful, but for some patients it might have been their only chance. However, there were a few folk remedies that might have provided marginal benefits. Willow bark tea, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, would have helped reduce fever and pain. Honey, which has antibacterial properties, applied to the buboes after they burst, might have helped prevent secondary infections, though it wouldn't have addressed the underlying plague bacteria. Keeping fever down with cool compresses and ensuring adequate hydration would have been among the most helpful supportive care measures. Some people survived by lancing the buboes themselves and draining the pus, then washing the wound, though this was extremely painful and dangerous to do without proper tools or knowledge. The folk medicine tradition in medieval Europe was often more practical and observational than the formal medicine practiced by university-trained physicians. Village healers, often women, had generations of accumulated knowledge about what actually worked for various ailments, even if they didn't understand why. These healers used herbs, foods, and practices that had been observed to help, and while they had no effective treatment for plague itself, some of their supportive care measures were better than what physicians offered. Willow bark had been used for centuries to reduce fever and pain, and while it couldn't cure plague, making a patient more comfortable and reducing fever could help them maintain strength to fight the infection. Chamomile tea could help calm anxiety and promote rest. Mint could help with nausea. These simple remedies didn't address the plague bacteria, but they addressed symptoms in ways that kept patients more comfortable and possibly more able to survive. Hydration was perhaps the single most important supportive care measure, and this was something that folk healers often understood better than physicians. Plague caused high fevers and sweating, which led to severe dehydration. A dehydrated patient would weaken rapidly and their organs would begin to fail, even if the plague bacteria hadn't yet killed them. Keeping a plague patient drinking was critical but also challenging, as many patients became delirious and didn't want to drink, or they were too weak to drink unassisted. Water was the most basic fluid, but other options included weak ale or beer, which were often safer than plain water in medieval times, herbal teas, thin soups or broths if the patient could tolerate them, and watered wine. The goal was to replace the fluids lost through fever and sweating, which might mean getting the patient to drink several pints of liquid per day. This required patient, persistent effort from caregivers who would sit with the patient and encourage small sips frequently throughout the day. Nutrition during illness was another challenge. Plague patients often lost their appetite entirely, and eating might cause nausea or vomiting. However, maintaining some nutrition was important for giving the body energy to fight the infection. Medieval medical theory actually had some counterproductive ideas about this, suggesting that patients with fevers should be starved to avoid feeding the disease. In reality, the opposite was true. Maintaining nutrition helped. Practical foods for a plague patient would be things that were easy to swallow and digest. Broths made from meat or bones, which provided protein and minerals. Soft bread or porridge, eggs prepared in various ways, honey which provided quick energy, and mashed or pureed vegetables if the patient could tolerate them. The food should be offered in small amounts frequently rather than large meals, as the patient's stomach would be sensitive. Even if a patient could only take a few spoonfuls at a time, these small amounts of nutrition accumulated over the day and helped maintain strength. Temperature management was crucial for plague patients. High fevers, if left unchecked, could cause brain damage or death even before the infection itself killed the patient. Medieval people understood that high fevers were dangerous and used various methods to cool feverish patients. Cool, wet cloths could be laid on the forehead, neck, and wrists, where major blood vessels were close to the skin. These cloths would be changed frequently as they warmed up, and this simple intervention could help bring down a dangerous fever. In extreme cases, a patient might be sponged all over with cool water, though this had to be done carefully to avoid chilling them too much, as uncontrollable shivering would stress the body further. Some healers used cool baths for very high fevers, having the patient sit in a tub of lukewarm water, which was more effective than cloths alone, but was difficult to arrange and could be dangerous if the patient was too weak. The goal was to bring the fever down to safer levels without causing shock from too rapid cooling. The psychological aspects of surviving the plague would have been as challenging as the physical aspects. Imagine living for months or even years under the constant threat of a horrible and sudden fate. The stress would have been immense. People responded in various ways. Some became deeply religious, attending Mass multiple times daily, engaging in extreme acts of penance, or joining flagellant movements where participants whipped themselves bloody in public processions, believing this would appease God's wrath. Others responded by abandoning all moral restraints, engaging in hedonistic behavior, and living as if each day might be their last, because it very well might have been. For your mental health and survival, you would have needed to find a middle path. Maintaining hope and a sense of purpose would have been important. Keeping to a routine, engaging in productive activities, and finding ways to maintain connections with others, even if at a distance, would have helped preserve your sanity. Community responses to the plague varied widely, and understanding them would have helped you navigate the social landscape. Some towns tried to implement quarantine measures. Venice was one of the first to do this systematically, requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before being allowed to dock, which is where we get the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Some cities posted guards at the gates to prevent travelers from entering. Houses with sick inhabitants were sometimes marked with red crosses and sealed with the family inside, left to either recover or perish. These measures were crude and often cruel, but they did slow the spread somewhat in places where they were rigorously enforced. If you lived in a city implementing strict quarantines, you would need to be careful not to show any signs of illness, as being locked in a plague house was often a sentence to certain infection, even if you had been healthy initially. The implementation of quarantine measures revealed both the best and worst of human nature under extreme stress. In Venice, when the quarantine regulations were established in 1348, the city created special plague islands called lazarettos, where suspected cases were isolated. Ships arriving from infected ports would be directed to these islands, where passengers and crew would spend 40 days in isolation before being allowed into the city proper. If anyone developed plague during the quarantine period, the 40 days would start over for everyone. This was harsh, but effective to some degree. The guards who enforced these quarantines faced considerable risk themselves, as they had to interact with potentially infected people. Some guards took their duty seriously and enforced the rules strictly. Others could be bribed to let people through, or fled their posts when they feared infection, allowing the quarantine to collapse. The practice of sealing plague houses, where families with infected members were forcibly confined to their homes, was implemented in many cities, but was one of the cruelest responses to the plague. A family might report that one member had fallen ill, and authorities would immediately come to nail boards across the door and post a guard to ensure no one left. The entire household would be trapped inside with an infected person, making it nearly certain that everyone would catch the disease. Food would be left outside the door, though sometimes guards would steal it for themselves, leaving the sealed families to starve as well as sicken. Windows would be watched to ensure no one escaped. Some desperate families did manage to escape through windows or by bribing guards, fleeing into the night to try to reach safety elsewhere, though in doing so they might carry the infection with them and spread it to new areas. The sealed house policy likely killed many people who might otherwise have survived by fleeing, but it did prevent infected families from mixing with the general population and potentially spreading the disease further. City gates became checkpoints where authorities tried to screen travelers for signs of plague. Guards would question people about where they came from, whether there was plague in their town, and whether they had any contact with sick people. They would look for visible symptoms like fever, weakness, or buboes, though pneumonic plague victims in the early stages might show no extremal signs. Some cities required travelers to present letters from their hometowns, certifying that they were healthy and from a non-infected area, though these letters could be forged. The guards at the gates had almost impossible jobs, trying to identify infected people who might not yet show symptoms while processing enough traffic to keep commerce moving. Some guards were conscientious and tried their best. Others were more concerned with collecting bribes than protecting the city. A determined traveler with money could usually gain entry regardless of the rules. The question of whether to obey or evade these community quarantine measures presented a moral and practical dilemma. From a personal survival standpoint, if you were healthy and your city was infected, you would want to leave despite any quarantine restrictions trying to keep people in. The health of the overall community might be better served by everyone staying put, but your individual survival would be better served by fleeing. If you were trying to enter a city that had quarantine restrictions, you might need to evade the checkpoints or bribe guards to gain entry. These actions could be seen as selfish and potentially harmful to others, but in the context of a plague that was killing half the population, the normal social contract had broken down and individual survival became the paramount concern for many people. Those who rigidly followed rules that trapped them in infected areas had higher mortality than those who broke the rules to escape. The economic impacts of the plague created both dangers and opportunities. As the workforce was decimated, labor became scarce and wages rose dramatically. For peasants and laborers who survived, this actually led to improved economic conditions in the years following the plague. However, during the height of the outbreak, economic activity ground to a halt in many areas. Shops closed, fields went unplanted and unharvested, and trade routes were disrupted. This meant that food shortages and price inflation were serious problems. If you had resources saved or stockpiled before the plague arrived, you would have been in a much better position. Having skills that were valuable, such as farming, baking, or smithing, would have ensured you could trade for necessities. Being able to produce your own food would have been the ultimate security. The plague also led to increased social persecution and violence that you would have needed to navigate carefully. As people desperately sought explanations for the catastrophe, scapegoating became common. Jewish communities were particularly targeted, accused of poisoning wells or somehow causing the plague through malicious acts. In many cities, Jewish populations were attacked and killed by angry mobs or driven out of towns. Foreigners, beggars, and anyone who seemed different or suspicious might also be blamed. If you were part of a vulnerable group, staying hidden and avoiding drawing attention to yourself would have been crucial. Even if you weren't part of a targeted group, getting caught up in mob violence or social chaos was a real danger, and avoiding crowds and public gatherings would have protected you from this as well as from disease. Religious responses to the plague were intense and varied. Many people believed the plague was divine punishment for human sin. This led to increased religious devotion, but also to some harmful practices. Pilgrimages to holy sites actually helped spread the plague as people traveled and gathered in large groups. Some religious movements became extreme, such as the flagellants mentioned earlier, who moved from town to town in large processions, which again facilitated disease spread. For your survival, maintaining your faith, if that provided comfort, would have been fine, but avoiding large religious gatherings would have been important. Praying alone or with your immediate household would have been safer than attending crowded church services. Some priests who continued performing their duties had high mortality rates because they were constantly in close contact with dying parishioners. The natural environment could have been either a threat or a resource, depending on how you used it. Forests provided places to hide and resources like game, berries, and wood for fires. Rivers and streams provided water and fish. However, these same resources attracted others, so truly remote locations were better than popular hunting or fishing spots. Some people survived by becoming temporary hermits, living in the wilderness until the plague had passed through their region. This would have required survival skills, such as knowing how to build shelter, find or trap food, identify edible plants, and make fire. For someone with these skills, the wilderness could have been a refuge. For someone without them, it would have been trading one death sentence for another. The duration of the plague outbreak varied by location. In some places, the worst was over in a few months. In others, the plague lingered for a year or more. The Black Death's initial wave swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, but the plague didn't disappear after that. It came back in waves for centuries afterward, with major outbreaks occurring every few generations. This meant that your survival strategy would have needed to be sustainable not just for months, but potentially for years, and you would need to be prepared for the plague to return even after you thought it was over. Building a sustainable, isolated lifestyle would have been better than just temporarily avoiding the disease. Signs that the plague was waning in your area would have included seeing fewer new cases, hearing that nearby towns were recovering, and noticing that traders and travelers were beginning to move through the region again. However, you would need to be cautious about emerging from isolation too soon. Just because cases had decreased didn't mean the danger was entirely past. Waiting several weeks or even months after the last reported case in your area before resuming normal activities would have been the safest approach. Even then, maintaining some of your protective practices, like avoiding close contact with people who had been sick and keeping your home sealed against rats, would have been wise. The aftermath of the plague would have presented its own challenges and opportunities. With so many people gone, there would be abandoned properties, unclaimed goods, and a general breakdown of normal legal and social structures. Some survivors engaged in looting and theft. Others tried to maintain order and rebuild. Land that had been owned by people who perished without heirs became available. In some areas, this led to disputes and violence. In others, it allowed surviving peasants to claim better land and improve their circumstances. Navigating this changed world would have required caution and good judgment. Making enemies during this chaotic time could have been dangerous, as traditional authorities and justice systems were weakened or absent. One interesting aspect of plague survival was that some people seemed to have natural resistance. There were documented cases of individuals who were heavily exposed to the plague, even caring for sick family members, yet never contracted the disease themselves. Modern research has identified genetic factors that can provide some resistance to Yersinia pestis, involving mutations in immune system genes. If you happen to have such a mutation, you would have had a significant survival advantage that had nothing to do with your choices or behaviors. However, you couldn't have known this at the time, so you would still need to follow all the precautions as if you were vulnerable. The role of domestic animals beyond cats and dogs also deserves consideration. Livestock like pigs, chickens, and cows could be infected with fleas, but they weren't typically hosts for the oriental rat flea that carried plague. However, they could still be vectors for fleas in general, so keeping animal living areas separate from human living areas would have been important. On the other hand, these animals provided food security through eggs, milk, and meat, which made them valuable for survival. The key was maintaining them in a way that minimized flea exposure, which meant keeping their enclosures clean and dry, as fleas prefer humid, dirty environments. Clothing choices would have mattered more than people might have realized. Fleas can't easily penetrate smooth, tightly woven fabrics, but they can nestle into loose, rough weaves like wool or linen. Medieval clothing was typically made from these materials, which meant it could harbor fleas. Smooth leather or very tightly woven fabrics would have been better barriers. Additionally, light-colored clothing would have made it easier to spot fleas, which are dark brown or black. Regularly inspecting and shaking out your clothes and periodically exposing them to heat by hanging them near fires or in direct sunlight would have helped kill any fleas that had gotten into the fabric. Some people adopted the practice of changing their clothes frequently and washing them in very hot water, which would have been effective but labor-intensive with medieval washing methods. Sleeping arrangements would have been another key consideration. Many medieval people slept in communal rooms or even in communal beds with multiple family members. For plague survival, having your own sleeping space would have been much safer. Bedding should be checked daily for fleas, washed frequently in hot water, and aired out in sunlight when possible. Sleeping off the ground on a raised bed frame would have been better than sleeping on rushes or straw on the floor, as fleas tend to stay closer to ground level. Some people created barriers around their beds using cloth, which wouldn't have been completely effective, but might have reduced the chance of flea bites during sleep. The question of traveling during the plague would have come up. Sometimes you might have needed to move to a different location, either to escape an outbreak or to reach safety. If you absolutely had to travel, doing so alone or with only healthy members of your household would have been safest. Traveling by little-used paths rather than main roads, avoiding all towns and villages, and camping in isolated spots rather than using inns would have minimized your exposure. Moving quickly and not stopping to help sick people you might encounter, as heartless as it sounds, would have been necessary for your own survival. Some people who fled plague-ridden cities and then stopped at a village along the way to rest ended up bringing the plague with them, decimating the very communities that sheltered them. Children presented a special challenge during the plague. Mortality rates were particularly high among the young, perhaps because of less developed immune systems, or because children were less likely to follow isolation protocols. If you had children, keeping them isolated would have been even more important than for adults. Children would naturally want to play with other children, explore, and touch things, all behaviors that increased plague risk. Explaining the danger to them in terms they could understand and keeping them entertained and occupied within your safe space would have been crucial. Some families survived by retreating to country estates, where children could play outdoors in private areas without encountering others. Pregnant women and new mothers faced particular vulnerabilities. The stress of the plague environment, combined with the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth, made survival more challenging. Additionally, most births were attended by midwives who would have been in contact with multiple households, creating a potential transmission chain. For a pregnant woman during the plague, finding a trusted midwife who was also practicing isolation or planning for an unattended birth if necessary would have been important considerations. After birth, the practices of lying in, where new mothers rested for weeks and were attended by female relatives and neighbors, would have needed to be modified to minimize outside contact. The elderly also had higher mortality rates from plague. Age-related decline in immune function meant that older people who contracted the disease were less likely to survive it. For elderly members of your household, ensuring they had the best possible nutrition, adequate rest, and were protected from cold and stress would have given them the best chance. However, the reality was that the very young and very old were the most vulnerable groups, and survival rates for these populations were significantly lower than for healthy adults. Food preservation techniques would have been critical knowledge during the plague years. With markets unreliable and the need to minimize outside contact, being able to preserve food when it was available would have been essential. Salting meat and fish, drying fruits and vegetables, smoking meats, pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine, and storing root vegetables in cool cellars were all common medieval preservation methods. Having a variety of preserved foods would have ensured adequate nutrition even during long periods of isolation. Malnutrition would have weakened your immune system and made you more susceptible to plague if exposed, so maintaining good nutrition was a survival priority. The use of alcohol is an interesting consideration. Wine and beer were common beverages in medieval Europe, often safer to drink than water because the fermentation process killed many pathogens. Some people believed alcohol provided protection against plague, and while it certainly didn't prevent infection, maintaining adequate hydration with fermented beverages that were unlikely to be contaminated would have been better than drinking potentially contaminated water. Additionally, alcohol could be used as a disinfectant for wounds, though medieval people wouldn't have understood it in those terms. They might have used wine or spirits to wash out the buboes if they lanced them, which actually would have helped kill bacteria and prevent secondary infections. Heating and ventilation of your living space would have required a delicate balance. Cold could be deadly in winter, so adequate heating was necessary. However, heated indoor spaces also attracted rats and fleas. The ideal would have been a well-sealed home that could be heated to human comfort levels, but that was too secure for rats to enter. Small, controlled fires rather than large hearths would have attracted fewer pests while still providing warmth. During warmer months, adequate ventilation would have been important for comfort and for preventing the buildup of fleas. But you would want to ensure that windows and vents had some kind of screening or covering that prevented rats from entering while still allowing airflow. The practice of keeping detailed records or journals, while uncommon among ordinary medieval people due to low literacy rates, would have been valuable for tracking the plague's progression. If you could read and write, keeping notes on when cases appeared in your area, which parts of town were affected, and any patterns you observed would have helped you make informed decisions about when to restrict your movements further or when it might be becoming safer to venture out. Some of the best historical information we have about the Black Death comes from chronicles kept by literate monks and clergy who recorded what they witnessed. Social interaction and mental health during prolonged isolation would have been major challenges. Humans are social creatures, and being cut off from normal social contact for months would have taken a psychological toll. Finding ways to maintain some connection while minimizing physical contact would have been important. Calling to neighbors from a distance, leaving messages or letters, and engaging in solo activities that provided mental stimulation, like crafts, tending gardens, or practicing skills, would have helped maintain psychological health. The mental aspect of survival is often overlooked, but maintaining hope and sanity would have been just as important as the physical precautions. Religion and spirituality provided psychological comfort for many people during the plague, and while some religious practices, like large gatherings, were dangerous, personal faith could have been a source of strength. Prayer, meditation, or religious reading could have provided meaning and hope during an otherwise terrifying time. However, it would have been important not to let religious beliefs override practical survival measures. Some people refused to flee from plague because they believed it was God's will and that trying to avoid it was sinful. Others refused to take basic precautions for similar reasons. A balanced approach that maintained faith while also taking practical action would have been the most adaptive response. The seasonal nature of the plague meant that your survival strategy would need to adapt throughout the year. During warm months, when plague transmission was highest, you would need to be most vigilant about isolation, avoiding contact, and maintaining your protective measures. As temperatures dropped in fall and winter, the immediate plague risk would decrease, But other dangers, like cold, food scarcity, and winter illness, would increase. A successful survival strategy would have required planning and preparation that took into account these seasonal variations. Stockpiling firewood before winter, preserving food during summer and fall harvest, and timing any necessary travel or outside activities for the lowest risk periods would all have been part of an effective yearly survival plan. The question of when the plague had truly passed and it was safe to resume normal life would have been difficult to answer. The plague tended to move in waves, with active outbreaks followed by quieter periods, but then returning months or years later. Some regions were affected multiple times over decades. Being too quick to abandon your protective measures could have been fatal if the plague returned. On the other hand, remaining in strict isolation indefinitely wasn't practical or healthy. A gradual return to normalcy, maintaining some key protective practices like avoiding sick people and keeping your home rat-proof would have been the wisest approach. Building a sustainable new way of life that incorporated the lessons learned during the plague rather than trying to return exactly to pre-plague normal would have been the best long-term strategy. The long-term consequences of surviving the plague extended far beyond just having lived through it. Survivors faced a radically changed world. Labor shortages meant economic opportunities for some, but also social instability and breakdown of traditional structures. Many survivors experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, having witnessed horrors beyond imagination and having lost most or all of their loved ones. Some people emerged from the plague years hardened and cynical. Others became more compassionate and philosophical, having faced their own mortality. How you processed the experience psychologically would have affected your ability to rebuild your life afterward. One of the most important factors in long-term survival would have been flexibility and willingness to adapt. People who rigidly clung to old ways of doing things, old social hierarchies, or old beliefs about medicine and disease were less likely to survive than those who could observe what worked and adjust their behavior accordingly. While medieval people didn't have scientific understanding of disease transmission, those who noticed patterns, such as the correlation between rat populations and plague cases, or the danger of close contact with sick people, and who acted on those observations even when it went against conventional wisdom or social norms, improved their survival odds significantly. Building resilience before the plague arrived would have given you a significant advantage. People who were already skilled at self-sufficiency, who had experience with gardening or farming, who knew how to preserve food, who had basic medical knowledge like treating wounds or fevers, and who had mental fortitude and discipline would have been better equipped to handle the challenges the plague presented. Once the plague was already in your area, it was too late to develop many of these skills. The time to prepare for a disaster is before it arrives, a lesson that remains true today. Community support networks, when organized carefully, could have actually improved survival odds rather than harming them. A small group of families who isolated together, who agreed to follow strict protocols about contact with outsiders, and who could support each other with shared resources and labor, might have fared better than individuals trying to survive completely alone. However, this would have required careful vetting of all members, agreements about quarantine protocols for anyone who had to have outside contact, and absolute discipline in following the agreed-upon rules. One infected person entering such a group could doom everyone, so the standards would need to be strict and enforced without exception. The geographical lottery of where you lived when the plague struck played a huge role in survival. Cities and towns had mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 70 or 80%. Rural areas generally fared better, with some remote villages experiencing much lower death rates or even escaping entirely. Ports and trade centers, where the plague typically arrived first and where population density was highest, were the most dangerous places to be. If you had been a rural farmer living in an isolated area when the plague began, your baseline survival odds would have been much better than if you were a city merchant, regardless of what actions you took. This wasn't fair, but it was reality. Sometimes survival comes down to factors beyond your control, and acknowledging this is important rather than blaming victims who died despite their best efforts. The role of trade goods and materials in disease transmission was something a few observant people might have noticed. The plague often seemed to spread along trade routes and to appear in warehouses and shops before spreading to residential areas. While medieval people couldn't have understood that rats hiding in shipments of grain or cloth were the actual vectors, they might have noticed the correlation between handling certain types of goods and getting sick. Merchants who dealt in textiles, grain, and other goods that provided rat habitat were at higher risk. If you had been in such a trade, either switching occupations temporarily or taking extreme care in how you handled goods, such as airing them out in sunlight and inspecting for rats or fleas before bringing them inside, might have helped. Some cities eventually implemented rules about quarantining goods as well as people, keeping merchant ships offshore for 40 days before allowing their cargo to be unloaded. Weather patterns and climate had subtle effects on plague transmission that would have been difficult to notice, but that modern research has revealed. Plague fleas thrive in temperatures between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit and in relatively dry conditions. Extremely hot weather kills fleas, as does extreme cold. Regions with more temperature extremes therefore had some seasonal protection. Very wet conditions also suppress flea populations. While you couldn't have controlled the weather, understanding these patterns might have influenced timing decisions, such as choosing to travel during the hottest part of summer or the coldest part of winter when flea activity was lowest, even though those would have been the most physically uncomfortable times to travel. The practice of burning personal possessions of plague victims was common in some areas, and this actually was an effective measure. Bedding, clothing, and other fabric items that had been used by someone who died of plague could harbor fleas and could transmit the disease to others. Burning these items destroyed both the fleas and any bacteria. Some communities also burned entire houses where plague deaths had occurred. This was extreme and economically devastating for survivors, but it did eliminate one potential source of continued transmission. On a personal level, if someone in your household died of plague, burning their possessions rather than keeping or selling them would have been the safer choice, even though the economic loss would have been significant. The psychological phenomenon of normalization or plague fatigue would have been a real danger after weeks or months of hypervigilance. Initially, when the plague arrived, everyone would have been terrified and extremely careful. But as time went on and the constant stress and restrictions wore on people, there would have been a strong temptation to relax precautions, to convince yourself that maybe the danger wasn't as bad as you thought, or that just one brief visit or one trip to the market wouldn't hurt. This kind of thinking got many people infected after they had successfully avoided the disease for months. Maintaining discipline and vigilance throughout the entire outbreak, not just at the beginning, would have been psychologically exhausting, but absolutely necessary for survival. Information and communication networks were limited in medieval times, which made it difficult to know where the plague was and how bad the situation was in other areas. Travelers and merchants brought news, but they also brought plague. Religious networks, with messengers traveling between monasteries and bishops sending letters to Rome, provided some information flow. If you could access reliable information about which regions were affected and which were still clear, it would help in making decisions about where to flee or whether to attempt trade with certain areas. However, information often lagged behind reality by weeks or months, and by the time you heard that a certain town was plague-free, the situation might have already changed. This uncertainty made decision-making extremely difficult and meant that sometimes the best choices were made based on incomplete information or even just luck. The economic disruption caused by the plague created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. The rigid feudal system began to break down as labor became scarce and workers could demand better wages and conditions. For survivors, particularly those from lower social classes, this was an opportunity to improve their circumstances. However, taking advantage of these opportunities required surviving first. Some peasants who lived through the plague were able to claim abandoned land, negotiate better terms with surviving lords, or even move to cities and take up trades that had been closed to them before. The plague was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it also broke open a social system that had been oppressive and unchanging for centuries. Children who survived the plague and grew up in its aftermath lived in a world that was fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. They grew up with a sense of life's fragility and unpredictability. Some historians believe that the cultural and artistic movements that followed the plague, including the Renaissance, were influenced by this shift in perspective. People became more focused on earthly life and human experience rather than purely on the afterlife. They questioned authorities, both religious and secular, who had failed to protect them from the catastrophe. For a child surviving the plague, these broader cultural shifts would have been the context for their entire adult life. The question of immunity after exposure is interesting. Some people who survived bubonic plague appeared to have resistance to future infections, though this wasn't universal or complete. The human immune system can develop antibodies to Yersinia pestis after an infection, providing some degree of protection. However, this wasn't well understood at the time, and people didn't know if surviving the plague once meant they were safe from future outbreaks. Some survivors did seem to act with less fear in later plague waves, perhaps from a sense that they had already faced death and survived, or perhaps because they intuited that they might have some protection. Modern research suggests that survival from bubonic plague can provide partial immunity, but it's not absolute, and different strains of the plague bacteria might not be covered by immunity from a previous strain. The role of prayer and religious ritual in survival is complex to assess. From a practical standpoint, religious gatherings were dangerous disease transmission events. However, for many people, faith was what gave them the strength to endure. If belief in divine protection provided the courage to maintain hope and keep fighting to survive, then it had real psychological value, even if it had no direct medical effect. Some people survived because their faith gave them a reason to keep going when they might otherwise have given up. Others died because their religious practices brought them into contact with infected people. There's no simple answer about the role of religion in survival, and it likely varied greatly depending on how individuals practiced their faith and whether they balanced spiritual needs with practical precautions. Genetic factors that we now know affect plague susceptibility would have been invisible to medieval people, but played a significant role in who lived and who died. The CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, which provides some protection against plague, is more common in European populations than others, possibly because of selection pressure from plague outbreaks over centuries. People with this mutation would have had better survival odds through no action of their own. Other genetic factors affecting immune response would also have mattered. This means that some of the people who survived weren't necessarily smarter or more careful than those who died. They were just genetically luckier. This is a humbling thought, but it's important for understanding that survival in catastrophic events is never purely about skill or knowledge. Chance and biology play enormous roles. The practice of fleeing cities when plague struck was so common that there's a famous Italian phrase about it, attributed to various medieval physicians. The best plague remedy is to flee quickly, go far, and return slowly. This encapsulates much of the practical wisdom about plague survival. Quick action at the first sign of outbreak, before widespread infection made travel dangerous. Distance, going far enough that you were truly isolated from infected populations. And patience, not returning until the danger had truly passed. Those who followed this advice, particularly wealthy nobles who had country estates to flee to, had much higher survival rates than the general population. This created resentment and social tension, as the wealthy could often save themselves, while the poor had no choice but to stay and face the disease. But it was effective. The importance of accurate observation and record-keeping cannot be overstated. While medieval people lacked scientific knowledge of disease, they were capable of noticing patterns and correlations. Those who paid attention to where and when plague cases appeared, who noticed that rat deaths seemed to precede human deaths, or who observed that people in certain occupations or living situations had higher risk, could use that information to protect themselves. Some physicians and chroniclers did keep detailed records, and these show that intelligent observation was happening even in the absence of a germ theory of disease. Critical thinking and empirical observation, even without formal scientific method, could improve your survival odds by helping you recognize and avoid high-risk situations. The aftermath of the plague included significant cultural and artistic responses. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic motif, showing death claiming people from all walks of life. This reflected the plague experience where rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful, all died together. The memento mori tradition, reminding people of their mortality, became more prominent. These cultural responses show the profound psychological impact the plague had on survivors. Processing trauma through art, literature, and ritual would have helped survivors cope with what they had experienced and witnessed. For individuals, finding ways to process and make meaning from the tragedy would have been important for long-term mental health and the ability to rebuild life after the plague. The transmission of knowledge about survival strategies would have happened informally through survivors sharing what had worked for them. However, much of this knowledge was circumstantial or misattributed. Someone might have survived because they followed a particular practice, but that practice might not have been the actual reason for their survival. This made it difficult to separate effective strategies from superstition. Additionally, those who were most successful at isolation had the least opportunity to share their knowledge with others, while those who survived despite risky behavior might have spread ineffective advice. This is a general problem with learning from disasters. The lessons that get passed on aren't always the right ones, and the most important lessons might come from people who successfully avoided the disaster entirely and therefore have no dramatic story to tell. The legal and social changes that followed the plague had long-lasting effects. Laws were passed trying to keep wages from rising and to prevent peasants from leaving their traditional manners to seek better opportunities. These laws were largely unsuccessful because the labor shortage gave workers leverage they had never had before. Women, having lost husbands and fathers, sometimes gained more independence and economic power. Children orphaned by the plague were taken in by surviving relatives, communities, or religious institutions, fundamentally changing family structures. Inheritance laws were challenged as traditional patterns of passing wealth were disrupted when entire family lines died out. For survivors, navigating this changed legal and social landscape required adaptability and sometimes a willingness to challenge traditional authorities and norms. The question of whether having previous experience with other diseases helped people survive the plague is interesting. Some historians have suggested that populations that had experienced other epidemics in the years before the Black Death might have had some cross-immunity, or at least more robust immune systems from regular exposure to various pathogens. However, the plague was so virulent and deadly that previous disease experience likely made little difference for most people. What might have helped was prior experience with crisis management and survival. Communities that had survived famines, wars, or other disasters might have been better at organizing themselves, rationing resources, and maintaining order during the plague, which could have indirectly improved survival rates by reducing secondary causes of death like malnutrition and violence. The role of leadership during the plague was critical. In cities and towns where authorities maintained order, organized food distribution, implemented quarantine measures, and prevented panic, more people survived. In places where leadership broke down, with officials fleeing or dying, chaos often ensued, making survival even more difficult. If you were in a position of leadership, whether as a head of household, a guildmaster, or a local official, having a clear plan, communicating it effectively, and maintaining calm authority would have helped those under your responsibility survive. If you were not in leadership, finding and following capable leaders, while also being prepared to act independently if leadership failed, would have been important. The medical profession faced a crisis during the plague that had long-term consequences. Many physicians died because they were in close contact with infected patients. Some fled, abandoning their duties. Others stayed and tried to help despite having no effective treatments. The failure of medieval medicine to provide any real help against the plague led to questioning of medical authority and traditional learning. This skepticism eventually contributed to the development of more empirical approaches to medicine, though this took centuries. For an individual during the plague, the practical lesson was that physicians couldn't save you, so you were largely on your own. This was terrifying, but also potentially liberating, as it meant you could ignore useless medical advice and follow your own judgment about what might help. The different responses to plague across Europe reveal cultural and social differences. Italian city-states tended to implement organized public health measures more quickly. Northern European regions sometimes had more chaotic responses. Some areas blamed supernatural causes more heavily than others. These different approaches had different outcomes, though it's difficult to separate the effects of policy from other factors like population density, climate, and chance. For an individual, being aware of how your own community was responding and being willing to go against the grain if local responses seemed ineffective or counterproductive could have been crucial. If your city was implementing quarantines, following those rules would help. If your village was organizing flagellant processions, avoiding them would be wise, even if it meant social condemnation. The experience of time during the plague would have been strange. Days might have felt endless, with nothing to do but wait and worry. Yet weeks and months could blur together. The normal markers of time, like markets, festivals, and holy days, were disrupted or canceled. For psychological health and maintaining structure, creating your own routines and ways of marking time would have been helpful. Simple practices like maintaining regular sleep schedules, eating meals at consistent times, and engaging in daily activities, even if they weren't strictly necessary, would have provided structure and a sense of normalcy that helped preserve mental health during an abnormal and terrifying time. The impact of the plague on family structures was profound and would have affected survival strategies. With so many deaths, households were often left with unusual compositions. A surviving child might be taken in by distant relatives. A widow might join another household for mutual support. Multiple families might consolidate into one household to share resources and labor. These ad hoc family arrangements could be helpful for survival if organized well, pooling resources and providing mutual aid. However, they could also be dangerous if they brought together people with different levels of plague exposure. Carefully organizing these living arrangements, possibly with separate buildings or areas for different family groups, to maintain some isolation while still cooperating would have been ideal. The question of whether to stay in your original home or move to a new location after the plague passed involved complex considerations. Your old home might have been contaminated with plague bacteria or fleas, suggesting a move would be safer. However, moving meant leaving familiar territory and possibly entering areas where plague was still active or where you would face competition from other survivors. Some people did abandon plague-affected cities entirely, leading to the growth of new settlements and the decline of old ones. For individuals, the decision would depend on factors like whether your home area still had viable economic opportunities, whether most of your community had survived or died, and whether you had skills that would transfer to a new location. The preservation of knowledge during and after the plague was challenging. Many books and manuscripts were destroyed, either deliberately because they had belonged to plague victims or accidentally through neglect, as monasteries and centers of learning lost their inhabitants. Some knowledge was lost forever because the last person who knew a particular craft, recipe, or piece of information died without passing it on. For survivors, making efforts to preserve knowledge, whether through writing things down if you were literate, or through carefully teaching skills to younger generations, became important work in the plague's aftermath. This wasn't just about survival during the plague, but about ensuring that human knowledge and civilization could continue after it. The environmental changes that followed the plague were significant. With so many fewer people, agricultural lands were abandoned and reverted to forest. Some regions experienced increased wildlife populations as human pressure decreased. The reduced human population meant less deforestation, less agricultural runoff, and, in some ways, an environmental recovery. For survivors, this meant both opportunities, like more game for hunting, and challenges, like less maintained infrastructure and fewer cultivated fields. Adapting to this changed landscape required different skills than living in the densely populated pre-plague world. The role of luck in survival cannot be ignored, even as we discuss strategies and choices. Many people who did everything right still died. Some people who took significant risks survived. The role of chance in whether a particular flea bit you, whether your immune system happened to mount an effective response, whether you encountered an infected person during the brief period when you had to leave your home for supplies, all of these factors were beyond anyone's control. Acknowledging this helps us understand that survival doesn't always correlate perfectly with skill or virtue. Sometimes, people survive or die for reasons that have nothing to do with their choices, and this hard truth would have been apparent to plague survivors who saw the random nature of death around them. The concept of social distancing, which became familiar to us in recent times, was actually practiced during the plague, though not by that name. People instinctively understood that distance from others provided safety. In some cities, rules were made about how close people could stand to each other in public spaces. Markets were reorganized to allow more space between vendors. These intuitive public health measures, arrived at through observation rather than scientific understanding, did provide some protection and represent one of humanity's first organized responses to an epidemic disease. The comparison to other historical plagues and pandemics can provide context. The Black Death was perhaps the most devastating pandemic in human history in terms of the proportion of the population that died, but it wasn't the last. Subsequent plague outbreaks continued for centuries, gradually becoming less severe as populations developed some immunity, as the most susceptible individuals had already been selected out, and as public health measures improved. Looking at how people adapted and survived these later outbreaks shows learning and evolution in survival strategies over time. Each generation that survived a plague outbreak passed on knowledge and sometimes genetic resistance to the next generation, gradually improving humanity's collective ability to survive these events. The recovery period after the worst of the plague had passed was not a sudden return to normalcy, but a long, difficult process of rebuilding. Fields needed to be replanted, trades needed to be relearned by new apprentices, buildings needed to be repaired, and social structures needed to be reconstructed. For survivors, this period required resilience, hope, and hard work. Some people thrived in this rebuilding phase, seizing new opportunities. Others struggled with trauma, grief, and the massive changes to their world. How individuals navigated this recovery period was as important for their long-term survival and flourishing as how they had navigated the plague itself. The rebuilding required different skills than surviving the plague. Skills like leadership, innovation, adaptability, and the ability to imagine and work toward a better future despite having lived through horror. In conclusion, surviving the Black Plague would have required a combination of factors, some under your control and some not. The most important controllable factors would have been early recognition of the threat, willingness to isolate yourself from others even at great personal and social cost, understanding the connection between rats and the disease even without knowing the mechanism, maintaining a clean living environment sealed against rodents, securing adequate food and water without exposing yourself to public markets, protecting your mental health during long isolation, and maintaining vigilance throughout the outbreak without succumbing to plague fatigue. Factors beyond your control would have included your genetic susceptibility, where you lived when the plague struck, your economic resources that determined your options for flight or isolation, and simple luck regarding exposure. The Black Death was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions that reshaped European civilization. But within that catastrophe, individual choices and actions did matter and could make the difference between survival and becoming another statistic in history's deadliest pandemic. The lessons from this historical event remain relevant today, reminding us of the importance of public health measures, the value of scientific understanding of disease, the need for social cooperation in crisis, and the recognition that survival in extreme circumstances requires both practical action and psychological resilience. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.